Hello, everyone. Welcome to this series by JURIST News. We have Ms. Hannah Srajer with us. She's a graduate worker, organizer, and a poet based in New Haven. She's currently pursuing a PhD in history from Yale University and has received a BA in history from Princeton. She's a founding member of Tight-Lipped, a podcast which is organizing project for people with chronic vaginal pain conditions. She's a recipient of Organization for American Historians 2022 Louis Pelzer Memorial Award, which is given annually for the best essay in American history by a graduate student. Shreyer's work, award-winning article, Imperfect Intercourse, Sexual Disability, Sexual Deviance, and History of Vaginal Pain in the 20th Century United States, examines the legal and medical history of vaginal pain in the United States. We are so grateful to have you here with us today. How are you today? How are you feeling?
I'm well. I'm excited to talk about my work. How are you doing?
I'm also doing well. Congratulations on your award. How did you come up with this idea? Could you give our viewers an insight on how you came up with this topic and what your article talks about?
Yeah, so I do political work around people who have these conditions, and a lot of that is drawn from my own experience. So something that came up over and over again while doing this work for and by people with chronic vulvovaginal conditions is that everyone kept telling us, well, doctors keep on saying this is all in my head, and they keep telling me that I'm just anxious, or they keep referring me to sex therapists or psychiatrists. They're not referring me to physical therapists or to gynecologists. And so I wanted to understand what's really going on here and what is the medical and legal history that's shaping the way that contemporary physicians are dealing with people who can't have penetrative intercourse.
Yes, we were just going through your article. So even like something I was reading up on endometriosis, on how it takes a lot of years for it to be diagnosed. There's so much misdiagnosis on simple treatments which are so common, be it vaginismus or be it endometriosis. You use the term the medical legal construction of marriage in your article. Could you talk more about it or explain to our viewers what you meant by it? And what are the legal constructions when it comes to something like vaginal pain?
Right. So what I'm specifically looking at, and again, I'm not a lawyer, I just do history of law, but I'm specifically looking at laws around marriage. And so in the United States, the way that courts have decided to litigate impotence around marriage law comes from basically canonical law, set the precedent. The 105th canon set the precedent for marriage law in a bunch of states in Europe. And it's Christian canonical law, but the United States didn't have ecclesiastical courts. So state legislators gave the judiciary the power to dissolve marriages in the case of impotence. So this happens in Pennsylvania in 1815, in New York in 1828, in Alabama in 1859, Mississippi in 1930. And so various states are defining impotence in different ways, but a case that they cite pretty heavily is Pain v. Pain in 1891, which is describing the condition as one of these parties to a marriage is physically incapable of entering into the marriage state. And so it becomes clear through the ways that the judiciary in various states are legislating these impotence laws, it becomes clear that impotence isn't defined by the inability to get pregnant. It's not defined by the inability to have sexual pleasure. It's actually defined by you are ruled impotent if you can't have penetrative sex frequently, if you can't have it fully, and if you can't have it for physical or mental reasons. So that becomes clear through these cases that in order to have a legally valid marriage, you have to be able to have frequent and complete penetrative sex, so total penetrative sex.
Yes,
which I thought was really
Yeah, even in India, I've heard decisions where like the Supreme Court has granted divorce on just the basis that if you're not able to have sex. I think that's the kind of judicial legislature which is there in India as well. You've also talked about sexual disability and sexual deviance. How has that interplayed in your article when it has come to vaginal pain? And have you also talked about other genders?
Yeah, so I think that's really important to think about these conditions as a form of sexual disability, and that's a type of disability history that's really understudied in disability studies and disability history in general. Is what are the implications for having a disabled vagina, for example, and how does that play out in the courts and in the medical field? And so something that I thought was really interesting is there's this case JT versus MT in the 1970s that is about whether that is ruling, it's about whether or not this divorced couple, one member of the divorce party, is entitled to alimony. And the defendant defendant husband says that their marriage was never real because this person is legally a man, because this person is a transgender woman. And so the courts actually end up saying, no, this was a heterosexual marriage. This was a valid marriage. You do owe your ex-wife alimony because of the quality of the transgender woman's vagina, that it was complete, that it was able to be penetrated, that she could have sex multiple times a week, etc., the appearance of the vagina. And so you see that even for transgender people, the ability to be defined as a legal woman, as a legal wife, is so tied to your capacity to be penetrated, the way that your genitals match a normative genital.
The court has just set up a standard. The case you mentioned, this one is from the 1970s. So did you like go back to the archives for this article a lot? Did you rely on a lot of judgments?
Yeah, so I relied a lot on judgments. I went through a lot of impotence cases because you can't like just look, you can't type in keyword vaginismus, right? You have to like go and look through. But I came across this case, actually, Joanne Meyerowitz, who is a professor in my graduate program, and she was actually the instructor to the course where I wrote this paper in. She has a book about the history of the creation of sex, gender, and sexuality, and transgender people. And she actually has this case in her book as well. And I was reading her book and I was like, like there's a lot here about the ability to be penetrated. And so then I went in and looked at the case a little bit more in depth. And I saw that this was clearly a really interesting way that the courts are continuing to define gender, really, by not having even a vagina, but by having a vagina that you can penetrate frequently, right? Which is so interesting.
Do you think that the courts have like come up with conversations and like started using the terms? You just said you can't just Google something like vaginismus as a keyword. Do you think that at this point the courts have just, are more in tune with what is happening in the world and more in tune with the medical legal history and how things are? Have they started using the regular right terms? Have they started identifying the problems?
I think, well, what's funny is the medical field isn't even in full agreement. You can go to a doctor and get 5 different diagnostic names for the same symptoms. So it's not standardized even in the medical field. So it wouldn't be, I imagine, standardized in the legal field either at this point.
But do you think like the conversation has changed over the time? Because I know that you were analyzing the 20th century mostly. So do you think the conversation has changed in the 21st century? Are courts more open to it? Or have they started like identifying features more often? Have the new types of issues started cropping up?
Yeah, I think that something I noticed, right, is that impotence law isn't really like litigated that much anymore,
Okay, yeah.
because divorce is so much more easily available. You don't need something like proof of impotence in order to receive a divorce. You can just go and get one.
Hmm.
So you see impotence cases decline drastically by like the mid 20th, a little like by the 60s, 1960s. And so I imagine that there are much fewer cases. And also there are different sort of interventions available than there were 40 years ago, even though a lot of the medical interventions are pretty similar as they've been for the last like 150 years.
I think this would be a very obvious question, but I have this very strong belief that most of the impotence cases would have been filed by men against their wives.
Yes.
Uh, I also wanted to know if there are like any legislative views or any views from the Congress about these things. Have they been deliberated properly? Because these are issues which a large chunk of women face. When I was researching on this interview, I realized how it's like a massive, massive amount of women face these issues, and all of them are put to the side. So, are there policies which are coming in place, if they're already not, about these things, or just apart from awareness, has there been any groundwork on it?
No, so I mean, the organization that I helped found and work for, Tight-Lipped, we're basically one of the few. There are other organizations like Endo
Yes.
Black, and the endometriosis world is a lot more built out. But there's really a lot of blank space around advocacy and legislation around these conditions. And you can see that obviously you're right. It's mostly men bringing impotence
Yeah.
cases against their wives, and it's a way that you are sort of left outside of. You basically don't even have the right to marriage if you can't have full and frequent penetrative sex according to these laws. But there's really, I would say, probably we're like 50 years behind in terms of like proper funding for these conditions, research, and awareness.
Even I think the first time I was exposed to these concepts were like Instagrammers who were like pelvic floor therapists who would just come up
Mm-hmm.
on your feed and probably like bring like, or maybe just, the small businesses who were working on something like sex toys and who would also come up with things and talk about vaginismus. I think those people have started to also create a lot of advocacy for this.
Yes, the Instagram community is really strong, and it's on TikTok too. And it's really the only way that anyone knows about these conditions, right? Because they're
Yeah.
so taboo.
Even with something like endometriosis, I think it's just a very um, much safer forum, and a forum with much more information than you could ever find by Googling it online.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely true. Yeah.
Because I was all while reading your article, I was actually looking at your Tight-Lipped resources, and I came across this article which said that there are more way 5 times more number of trials for like male penal issues than there are for like women, and
Yeah.
so the amount of research only is so small. So
Yes.
I also had one more question that the conversation is also about lack of awareness. It is clearly a very sexist conversation. How do you think something like an awareness about these issues can be raised?
Right. So right now, I mean, I have a lot of faith in structural organizing. So, organizing people around you to move power. So for me, that means having a grassroots advocacy organization. We're working on figuring out what campaigns we're going to be doing. Are we going to target the DSM to get the diagnosis of vaginal pain penetration disorder out of the DSM, which is a manual of mental disorders, right? It shouldn't be in
Okay,
the
yeah.
DSM. Are we going to target hospitals to start including vulvar exams and evaluations for vulvar pain in every sort of physical that they do, et cetera, et cetera? So I think it's really a patient-led movement. Working with physicians, we have physician allies,
Yeah.
to start changing the amount of research funding that people are getting, the diagnostic categories that these conditions are in, and the ways that the medical system is treating these conditions. I think only by working together with large groups of people can that happen. And that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think the conversation even goes like beyond sex. Even something like a pap test can just be so painful for a person. Or I think those are the conversations we just recently don't have. I also wanted to know, like, over the history, has the term of intersectionality changed? Do you think because of your research, the way people view intersectionality, or how the court specifically view intersectionality, has changed?
Could you say more about what you mean by intersectionality in
I
this?
probably mean like what it is to be a woman, because I think that has changed over the years, and what's probably sex is, and how different types of even sex have been normalized in so many different ways.
Yes. I imagine that there aren't very many judges who would grant someone a divorce based on their inability to be frequently and fully penetrated anymore. Maybe that probably wouldn't happen. But I do think we still live in a world that's really marked by our obsession with matching gender to genitalia, right? Something that I get into in the paper that's not really explored in the legal part is the ways that the medical community sort of associates people who can't have vaginal, they're lesbian or they're bisexual or they're gender non-conforming or they're trans, that there's something, gender and sexually deviant about them. And I still think we live in, thinking about the don't say gay laws in Florida, et cetera, like we still live in this, and all of the bills that are making it so difficult for trans kids to get healthcare, right? We still live in, I think, a legal landscape that is preoccupied with a woman being vagina. I do think a lot has also changed.
Litigation of importance in specific has changed across the US, and does it have any connotations with race? Do you see any racial differences? Because from what I've read myself about medical history for women, it has been that it has been assumed in a lot of spaces that Black women have more pain tolerance, and doctors have been very medically negligent over them. So do you think it has also shown in like the litigation of impotence, and how just generally the litigation of impotence has like changed over the years in the United States, and probably any differences between the East Coast or the West Coast?
Yeah, so absolutely race has a huge part in the way that disabled bodies are registered by the medical system, by the legal system. And I mean, James Marion Sims, who is the person who creates the term vaginismus, is obviously notorious for doing experiments on enslaved women, Lucy, Betsy, and Anarcha, who were also his nurses. And so you don't see a lot of women of color, Black women, immigrant women, poor women being diagnosed with vaginal pain. It's seen as sort of a disease of the upper class, of white women. It's a concern for eugenicists in the mid-century when they're worried that these young white girls won't want or be able to have sex and reproduce the race. So the labeling and naming of these conditions are very raced and classed. And I mean, as you mentioned, the ability to see and to be acknowledged for having pain. I imagine, so, my research leaves off in the 70s, so I can't really say what the last 40 years of impotence legal history has looked like. Again, I think that it has definitely declined because there is no fault divorce now, and you don't need a doctor to examine your wife to get out of a marriage, right? That's just not the same sort of thing. Though that is an interesting question, what if there's, I doubt that they're really even being litigated really anymore.
So, like for example, like I'm from India, and I was just talking to my mother, who's a doctor herself, and I was like, this is entire concept of vaginismus, and she was like, oh, I haven't heard about it. And the thing is, I realized it's not a very, very well-known concept in India. I'm sure only the 0.1% of people who probably just active on Instagram, who are probably just studying law, who probably just more involved in these things would know about it. And I was thinking that on the grassroots level, how would women get the healthcare for it? And leave healthcare, how would they even have the awareness for it? And they would just be suffering for such a long time and probably forever.
Yeah, I mean, it takes on average 8 years to get a proper diagnosis.
Yes.
Which is really intense. It takes a lot of resources. Health insurance in the United States usually doesn't cover pelvic floor physical therapy to treat these conditions. I would say it's pretty common for a medical doctor not to know what vaginismus means. It's pretty common for a medical doctor to not know what pelvic floor dysfunction means, or how to give a vulvar examination that actually looks for pain. Gynecologists even, right? So a lot of people suffer in silence. A lot of people feel like they can't tell their parents if they're younger, and they have to wait until they're older to deal with this. It's a real public health emergency, and it affects everyone that has a vagina.
When you mentioned about pelvic floor therapy, it just is such an important conversation, because I've realized that even for pregnant women, there have been issues where I've read that they've had issues and they have also had to go through pelvic floor therapy anyway. So it's just not something that has to be cut off from conversation. It's just not a conversation about sex. It's a conversation about just women living through life. There have been accounts of women who are pregnant, who have kids, who have just been pregnant. They're talking about how they had to do it to just continue with the day-to-day activities. So it's not just a conversation about sex and it's very limited, but it's a conversation about women's health in general. It's pelvic floor therapy is in fact related to larger bladder issues and other things as well.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, that's another thing that really gets lost, right? It's easy in the archive to find incidences where husbands mostly are upset that they can't have penetrative sex, but the other symptoms associated with pelvic floor dysfunction and vulvovaginal conditions are urinary, they're fecal, they can be burning pain. It can feel like you have a UTI all the time. I mean, it's an umbrella of really debilitating symptoms. And yet it's often reduced into, can I be penetrated? And I think that has a lot to do with the relationship between patriarchal norms of the medical system. But yes, absolutely. And I think that's really important to note. And I myself am someone who has these conditions, and it was very, very hard to find a diagnosis.
Yes. Have you, I also had a question, have you also worked on female genital mutilation in your research? Have you come across articles on this? Because it's a very big thing in India, and there's no ban in India on it as of now.
I haven't come across it, but I do know that a side effect of female genital mutilation is very, very painful penetrative sex. So I've done more work around the relationship between intersex conditions and conditions that don't allow for penetration, partially because of all of the surgery that was done on young children to make their genitals match a certain gender. So not genital mutilation in sort of that sense, but I've done more research around a different form of genital mutilation.
Could you also tell us about what is your podcast and your organization, and what kind of work do they usually focus on? And what are your hopes for this organization?
Yeah, so my organization, Tight-Lipped, we're a nonprofit. We've been around since 2019. You can follow us on Instagram or Twitter. So we started with a podcast, and you can find that on Spotify or iTunes. And we're working on the second season right now. And so the podcast is about breaking the stigma around these conditions. And we do interviews with experts, we do interviews with people with these conditions. It's sort of a narrative style. And then our grassroots advocacy work, we have a core team of 6 people, and we're choosing which campaign that we're going to run for the next year or so, whether we're targeting hospitals or insurance companies or medical schools, or like I said, the DSM. We're still figuring that out right now, but my hope is that we fundamentally shift the way medical systems and society identify and treat vulvovaginal pain conditions, because right now it's just such a stigmatized and forgotten and such a common condition.
Yeah, it's a very, very common condition. I wanted to ask if you have any parting remarks for our viewers.
Well, my parting remark is, if this sounds like you or someone you know, that it's extremely common. It seems like it's estimations are around 1 in 4 people with vaginas have some sort of conditions like this. So if you want to get involved in the community, you should. And obviously, you know, the least surprising part of my research was I thought that men were going to be the ones getting impotence cases against them, but it was just really interesting to see how much it was men actually bringing forward these divorce cases.
It's really funny because there's so much more research in erectile dysfunction, and it's just still men who are
I know. It's very funny. It's very funny.
Thank you so much for agreeing to interview with us. It was very insightful. It was very, very resourceful, and I really enjoyed the conversation. And
yes, me too.
I would really like to tell our viewers to just stay tuned, because a lot more interviews are coming up. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Just